Imagine that your job is to go into a river every day and pull out people who fell in a ways back and have been washing up and are either drowned or half drowned or badly injured or traumatized. And all day, every day, you wait for those people who have fallen into the river somewhere else, and you drag them out and you try your best to save them. So that's basically our healthcare system, including the mental health care system. We wait for people to get sick, to become psychologically unwell, to have mental health issues, to have physical health issues, and then we spend trillions and trillions of dollars trying to save them. Today's guest, Mark Butler, was doing that in the mental health field, helping people who had been suffering from burnout, helping people who had developed addictions, who had all sorts of other problems. And he realized he wanted to get in on the action before people fell in the river. So he started working with organizations and with individuals to deal with and prevent burnout. And he comes at it from not a theoretical perspective. He himself had a career in sales, marketing, management that was cut short by an experience of burnout that hit him out of the blue, that he did not understand, could not explain, and could get no help other than to leave the position in which he was working when it first happened. So he went then on a quest, a multi-year quest to understand mental health, to understand what are the factors that individuals and organizations can lead people to be resilient in the face of stressors and challenges and setbacks and failures, or what causes people to shut down and go into these burnout states. So in our conversation, we're going to talk about Mark's career trajectory, what he's discovered, and how each of us can help to create workplaces that are more human-centric and not just driven by numbers and processes. So without further ado, Mark Butler, welcome to the Plant Yourself podcast.
Thank you very much, Howie. It's a delight to be here. Thank you for asking me.
Yeah, so I don't really care what we talk about as long as we can hear your accent, which is just...
Well, you noticed I have one. All right.
Yeah, Australian, are you?
Well, here's the interesting thing. I've been here 36 years, so here a lot longer than I was in Ireland, but I think the one you're kind of born with and grow up with is the one that sticks. You know?
Yeah.
Yeah. So I'm afraid this is it now.
That may be a good metaphor for some of the psychological processes we're going to be talking about during this time. The stuff that sticks, even though you haven't exercised it for 36 years.
Exactly right. It's there, and it's like schema therapy, isn't it? It's a bit like the conclusions and everything we've reached from an early age. That's who we are now.
So, but luckily we've learned how to overwrite some of them. But let's hear about your linguistic and geographical schemas. Can you just tell us a little of your bio before we get into the juicy stuff?
Sure. Yeah. Thank you. So I've had a working life experience, I guess you'd call it. I was about 25 years in the corporate game, sort of in sales and marketing and general managerships. And at the same time, I was very fortunate to be able to live a sort of a double life. So my second life was in the mental health space. And that came from a burnout experience that I had maybe 20 years ago, thereabouts. I was absolutely flabbergasted that it happened to me. And so I wanted to learn a little bit more about it. So while I was still working full time, I changed jobs and in recovery and all of the rest of it. I started exploring mental health and what had actually happened to me. And I was just fascinated by it. And I had no real plan or anything like that. So I was still working full time, studying. And then the studying started to become a bit more intense. And one day I looked up and I had 2 master's degrees in mental health. And I had managed somehow to get my sort of practical hours up, a couple of hundred hours, whatever it was. But I worked with people because I was working full time. I I didn't sort of change careers at that point into the clinical sort of space, but I did my hours working with people in recovery from long-term addiction, people in, in the sort of homeless space, etc. And it just gave me an incredible insight into another world, so far removed from the corporate thuggery of salesmanship and one-upmanship and all of that happens. It was, I found another side of life and another side of the world that was really interesting. And so in time, I segued out of corporate and much more into clinical. And then,
so I was gonna interrupt you and say I don't want to pry, but then I realized that I was lying. I do want to pry. So you
pry away. I have no secrets.
Okay, well, good. Because when you say like burnout and recovery, like what can I ask? What happened to you?
Sure. Look, I was in a role where I had sort of competing strategies. So it was a joint venture organization, and so I was sort of two bosses, two organizations I was working for. Their own sort of marketing and go-to-market strategies were differing. And so I was trying to wear two hats, or as they say, if you sit between two stools, you'll fall, and that's kind of where it was at. I think it just became too much. I was trying to do too many things and trying to do too much and trying to sort of straddle those two completely differing worlds, that I suppose a conversation around burnout would be the traditional model there was exhaustion, absolutely. This kind of ability to do my best work and the sort of efficacy that they talk about. I found, for me, I was forgetting the names of my team, people that I was working with and alongside on a daily basis, and I just wouldn't be able to remember names. Other people I know in that space can kind of lose the ability to do simple arithmetic. They can, even to spell properly, and certainly forgetting things like deadlines and meeting appointments, etc. That happens to folks all the time, and I kind of found that was happening to me, and so it was like trying to walk through mud.
Adult onset ADHD.
Yeah, I guess it would be, yeah. But not hyperactivity, more hypo. You know what I mean? It was like just trying to walk through mud. And I would say, nowadays I spend a lot of my time talking about burnout with teams and with individuals and with organizations. And we now, we recognize what some of this is. But burnout's a sort of a creeper, in the sense that we don't really see it creeping up on ourselves because we make excuses and allowances for what we're experiencing and what we're feeling, to the extent that, we're kind of in denial a little bit. There's a sort of sometimes a stigma or a sort of a shame that we experience when we can't keep up and we're not able to perform as well as we thought we were. So we kind of give ourselves a hard time for that, and we'll give it every other name rather than I'm burning out and I can't keep up.
And I imagine there's some degree of isolation, especially if you've been a high performer beforehand, and everyone's got their confirmation bias. Yeah. And it's working in some way, it's working in your favor that people aren't necessarily noticing or registering or, chalking it up to flukes.
Yeah.
And yet the people sort of responsible for managing you are also not then stepping in and saying, hey, we need to intervene in some way.
There's more of an inclination, I think, to do it today, but certainly 20 years ago there wasn't. And burnout as a word wasn't used outside of the health sector, really. That's kind of where its origins were for so many years. But because it was creeping up and I was making excuses for myself, it was actually my team that stood up and said to me, noticed that I was struggling. And it was becoming emotionally difficult as well. So that sort of apathy started to set in eventually.
So what were your coping mechanisms?
They weren't good. I was in the film and television industry back then. So people at directorship level at my time would have had a mini bar in their office. And I remember somebody saying to me at one point in time, we had a sort of a monthly budget for what we could spend to put in the mini bar. And that was one budget I was always going to achieve. on a monthly basis. But so I probably drank too much. In fact, absolutely drank too much. I think would have been a problem. Smoked cigarettes. I just ended up. I did what everybody else does. It just became, my whole life became about work, and everything else was given a backseat. So any kind of extracurricular activity, relationship, everything gets put on the back burner while you're still trying to crawl through this muddy sort of patch. And so burnout in its essence is actually suppressing an emotional response or emotional needs. So that we feel exhausted. We feel like we can't keep up. We feel like we're letting everybody down. We feel apathetic. And then eventually we will feel anxiety and feel depressed. So, all of that language talks about our emotional response to the needs we have for ourselves and from our environment. And we suppress all of those in order to keep pushing through. So in its, at its sort of base level, burnout is a suppression of emotions. And I did all of that just to keep going. But eventually the piper must be paid, and I ground to a halt,
Was it emotional or physical as well?
It was emotional and physical. So in actual fact, for me, it was, I think it was, I'm trying to remember, there's a great saying that something, and that might have been Gabor Mate or somebody in that space, or Bessel van der Kolk, one of the sort of trauma specialists, said, if you don't listen to your body, it will give you the message in the end anyway. And that was pretty much what happened. So not just emotional burnout, I just ground to a halt, could not proceed, could not move forward. And for me, I made the decision to change roles, and that was a significant sort of shift for me. It took me a while to shift out of the role, but I moved to a new role, and the recovery was pretty rapid after that, because I was in an organization that recognized what had happened for me, because it was a close friend that I started working with, but also allowed me to sort of tap in to developing this other passion I had of finding out what the hell just happened. What was that just all about? And what happens for people when they go through that? So that sort of self-discovery journey was as cathartic, and it was part of the process. So it allowed me to do that.
So you said you're in sales and marketing.
Yeah.
And I also have a background in marketing. And one of the things that, basically the two things that I studied, it was psychology and math. Right. Like marketing is basically a combination of those two disciplines. But the psychology that I had learned was, it wasn't in its essence evil, but it was tilted, and I tilted it in my mind toward what I'm going to call manipulation.
Yeah, it's been said a number of times before that. When, the forefathers of the idea of psychology sort of came about, it happened around the same time that marketing sort of as a concept sort of became more apparent at that time as well. It seemed to be born around the same time. Mm-hmm. So whereas one was, as you just said, manipulating people's behavior, the other one was helping people's behavior. So, what can we do to help people, and how can we cash in on this? That sounds a bit sort of materialistic, but there were two kind of opinions, or two schools that came out of the same sort of philosophy, if you like. Yeah.
Well, I mean, I've seen this with, one of the best-selling psychology of marketing books is Influence by Cialdini. It seemed like, I read an early edition, and it seemed like he was trying to teach us how not to be manipulated. But the book has become the handbook for manipulation.
I'm not aware of the book. I must check this one out.
Oh, okay. Yeah. I think, now I'm embarrassed for making it sound like everyone should know this book. It was, I guess, in the seedy circles that I grew up in as a marketer. Robert Cialdini's Influence. He talked about things like just our biological hardwiring for, let's say, reciprocity.
Yeah.
And so there were all these experiments where you were sitting and with someone else waiting to do an experiment, and that person was a confederate of the study
Yeah.
coordinators, and they went and they got you a Coke from the Coke machine, and you didn't ask for a Coke, and you might not even like Coke, but you took the Coke, and then after the experiment, whatever little test, they asked their son is doing a raffle at school, would you buy some tickets? And they found a huge difference in the experimental condition of the person brought you a Coke versus they didn't.
They didn't. So, right, that's really interesting.
Right. So it's that
Wow.
sort of thing, and like social contagion, where
Yeah.
everyone's looking up, you're looking up, and so how to take advantage. He was trying to teach us how not to be taken advantage of, but I read it as a manual for, okay, this is what I got to get in the sales letter. Give them something first, give them value first, talk about all the people who are using the product.
Yeah. Really interesting. I'm kind of reminded of Reader's Digest, and I might be unfair when I mention them now as the concept. But are you aware of what Reader's Digest was like? It was no.
No.
No, okay. Yeah, I won't even go there then. You can edit that bit out if you like.
I'm dying to know.
And look, I
imagine they did a lot of testing of headlines, as what I remember.
It was really they used to do sort of compendiums of books. So instead of buying a new book, you'd get a sort of a quarter of the book, sort of a bit like Blinkist does now, but in a different sort of a. Not quite as condensed as we'd say a Blinkist would do. But then there was always the sort of, when you were a member of Reader's Digest, the book arrived monthly, but you were also in a draw to win this. And there was all of these other periphery ancillary things that seemed exciting, that made you want to sort of stay in the club. And you felt bad about ever actually sort of getting out of it, just in case, kind of thing. It was clever ploy to get people to sort of remain. Remain in the subscription.
Anyway, where I was going with that was that you and I had a kind of, I'm assuming, I'll ask you, like, your education in marketing, like, taught you a lot of psychological concepts, but like those concepts didn't buffer you, they didn't help you. So I'm curious, like, what the difference was when you were studying, marketing psychology versus, or just, being exposed to it versus when you actually needed to heal.
I never saw a connection between the two when I needed to heal. That was really just rallying my own sort of resources as best I could. Is kind of where I went with it, and it wasn't so much around the marketing or in the end I was involved in sort of acquisition type work, and publishing of film and television content, and so kind of away from the sales and marketing side of it and more into the sort of product sort of development, if you want, for a better term. And didn't make much of a connection between the sort of psychology of marketing or anything and what my experience was like. Because by then I was now firmly immersed in sort of our behaviors and we touched on the topic of schema a little while ago, but the whole idea of exploring myself and ourselves and what makes us tick and then what makes us not tick, more to the point. Which is how then I ended up working in the addiction space and working with veterans with post-traumatic stress disorders and sort of co-occurring substance use issues, etc. That's the bit that really interested me, was, why we don't always sort of tick as well as we perhaps could, and what's going on for people, and why is it sometimes a slow sort of slide into sort of this maladaptive sort of behaviors. And then that's what sparked that whole conversation. And so I walked away from the whole sales and marketing, film and television side of things and completely into the clinical space. But then it was kind of the ambulance at the bottom of the cliff, and it was kind of, not the same people having the same things happening, but different people having similar problems and challenges in their lives that they thought were exclusive to them. And, you know, it's like Kristen Neff, who is the self-compassion sort of guru, the Brené Brown of self-compassion, if you like, if I can say that. Well, I have, so I did. So, but Kristen Neff talks about the sort of common humanity, the shared experience or shared existence we have. You know, there are 80 recognized emotions, something in and around that number, and 8 billion of us on the planet now. So when we think we're the only one experiencing something, we're not. You know, it's a shared common humanity. And so I found myself in that space. But you're in Barcelona, you're an American in Barcelona, I'm an Irishman in Australia. So, you know, we're kind of well traveled. But I have noticed that we're not great at prevention of mental health challenges here in Australia. Our health budget, we spend actually exactly 1.34% at the last count of the health budget is spent on preventing illness, which is about a half to a third of comparable countries like the US or like the UK or Canada or New Zealand. But we spend 3 times the global average on treatment of mental health challenges. And that always struck me as that's a bit imbalanced. And even then we're spending 3 times the global sort of level, and it's still pitifully below what's really needed. So I just, you know, I shudder what's happening in the rest of the world. But this much I know, that if we did have a greater focus on prevention, how much better the world would be. So I then walked away from the clinical side, and I'm now in the sort of corporate space, working with organizations in preventing psychosocial hazards and other mental health sort of challenges that workplaces and people face. And it is infinitely more fulfilling. Actually, well, that's maybe not completely true. It is very fulfilling. There's no doubt about that. But I think I never felt more alive than I did when I was in the therapy room, once, you know, being there with somebody who was experiencing this kind of manifestation of what can be, if that makes sense. Experiencing somebody's aha moments when they, you know, when they find that they do have control of their own destiny. It's a fabulous place to be. Very humbling.
Do you ever imaginally go back and treat yourself?
Oh. What should I have done, or where could I have gone?
Yeah, the conversation that young Mark would have had with you now that would have helped.
Yes, I do. Look, and I don't know if you have heard of Gestalt therapy, which is the one I specialized in.
Oh, you're a Fritz Perls guy.
Yeah, absolutely.
Oh man, we gotta have awful. We're gonna geek out so much. I'm not gonna have any audience left. But
all right, okay.
Maybe wet our whistle. I love I read Gestalt therapy. I was way too young to understand it. I read it because somebody recommended it to me, and I just there's like little bits and bobs. Like the thing I remember is like experiences are like food that doesn't get digested. The thing I took from that. But can you talk a little bit about Gestalt?
Sure. Well, look, you know, I think the bit that most people are aware of, and the bit that seems to come up most of the time, is they talk about unfinished business. This is where which is true. And Gestalt, there isn't a literal English translation for it, but it's a kind of a completing of a whole. And so Gestalt talks about when that sort of completion of the cycle or circle of experience isn't complete, we are left with gaps in our sort of existence. And so as a Gestalt therapist, I had to do a number of years of personal work. So when you're asking about young Mark, speaking to young Mark, I did about 6 years of it. Unpacking and rebuilding and breaking down and starting again. It's an incredible journey. But what most people, that's where I was going. What most people know about or hear about Gestalt, they talk about like the empty chair work as an example. And so the unfinished business, about having a conversation with somebody who is no longer here, as a typical example. The unfinished the things we never got to say to a parent or someone who's passed. And when I first heard about this, I was kind of going, it's all a bit woo-woo, isn't it? Talking to an empty chair, really. But when I saw it actually happening and experienced it myself, it was profound. And now, I'm a scientific mind, a science background. And so when I hear this idea of speaking to an empty chair and it being sort of somehow cathartic or fulfilling, it didn't make any sense to me until I actually experienced it and saw it. And so we now know that it's more important that we get to say the words we need to say than it is for the other person to hear it. And for your listeners, a really good example of that is if you've ever been in an argument and then 6 hours later you think about what you should have said and what you'd love to have said if you had the time back. And you start to say it to yourself and you find your energy, your anger sort of rises up again as a result of the argument. Then you say what it is you need to say. And there's some kind of cathartic sort of experience in doing that. And so, it got me thinking about maybe the brain doesn't tell the difference between the event and an experience or a memory of the event. And if that's so, then the person doesn't have to be in the chair for you to actually say what it is you wanted to say or you missed saying, that you can get it out in that way. Fabulous.
Yeah. Well, I mean, the brain doesn't know shit. The brain, it's locked in a dark box.
I say to people all the time, the thinking, cognitive, executive thinking part of the brain is the last place in the body to know what's going on. And people go, oh yeah, whatever. Trust me on this. It is the last place to know. Everything else has actually happened around you, and thinking just fight or flight response is a typical example, it's really interesting. There was a great story. One of my lecturers was working with a client who was very badly triggered by her mother. And so they worked up to bring her mother into the room, figuratively, sit her in the empty chair, now have the conversation, say what it is you want to say to your mother. So she said it, and it was, hugely sort of tiring for her and highly emotional. And then it was, okay, now sit in the chair, and how would it be as your mother hearing that? So they went through all this process, and getting near the end of the session, the therapist, who was one of my teachers, said to her, look, why don't you leave your mother here this week? And when you come back next week, she'll be here. So I'll look after her. So just leave her here. You don't bring her home with you for now. And she said, ooh, can I do that? And he goes, yeah, absolutely. The chair, leave her there and come back next week and she'll be still here. And she came back the next week and had never had a more relaxing, fulfilled, productive week as she had when her mother was back in the therapy room. It's just, now, she wasn't really there, but there was just, she was able to live her life as if it was the case. Kind of unfinished business. Hugely interesting.
That's the thing. One of my teachers, John Connolly, talks about the two parts of mind that are not, it's not like a Lexus where you build the sound system into the vehicle. It's like, you take a Model T and you try to put a Blu-ray into it, right? Because we have the same mind as any other mammal that's looking to like avoid threat. Yeah. And is focused solely on what's in front of us. Right? Is there a lion? Is there not a lion? Is there a patch of strawberries? Is there not a patch of strawberries? And then we have this imaginal prefrontal brain that can make shit up. Yes. And then the mind is going, oh my God, my mother's yelling at me. Yeah. Even though she's been dead for 28 years.
She's dead for 20 years. And yet it's that we still, we can still face it and feel it. That's our blessing and our curse is I think we have the ability to say what if. That the mammals don't have, So, and this is our anxiety, isn't it? Our heightened anxiety at play. What if we catastrophize things and we ruminate and we worry and we just create all of these sort of issues for ourselves, blessing and a curse, I guess. Yeah.
So one of the things I really wanted to focus on in the conversation with you is, and this is on behalf of me and my listeners. Sure. I'm sure there's all of my listeners are interested in health,
Yeah.
The ones who aren't just realized that they have to unsubscribe. I just said it overtly, right? Like being like wellness and psychological wellness, planetary, communal, individual health. And a lot of us, me included, have been working in some analog of a clinical space, working with people who are already in need of healing. And I'm really interested in what your journey was like and what it's like now and the kind of work you do. Have taken that clinical experience, the understanding, the need. My audience understands really well that prevention is more important than cure,
Sure.
because we're all talking about, well, if you eat this way, doctors don't learn about nutrition, all that stuff.
Yeah.
But we also don't learn about emotional health and psychosocial well-being. And so I'm thinking like you're having an impact at a different kind of scale. It's not necessarily better or worse. It seems to be to some degree more fulfilling for you as a whole. And I'm sure there's, like, for me also, and for a lot of my listeners, this idea that we can take what we know in this narrow field and apply it more broadly as a preventive in society. And maybe, not leading with our mission, our particular thing. I'm a vegan and everyone's got to go, but leading with an understanding of what the bigger issues are and kind of taking it to a higher, more abstract, more conceptual level, and then helping where it's needed.
Yeah. Look, for me, I think, as I said, I was lucky to live kind of two lives for a while, so I've crammed a lot in. And if I've learned anything, and looking at the frailty of life as much as how people can actually turn around, transform, change, what was a really difficult existence and come back into a life that even in many cases is even more fulfilling than the one they've sort of transformed from. And I know we don't do that by just focusing on one thing. So, for example, working out, going to the gym, whatever, should never be about body. That should be about mental health, as far as I'm concerned. It should be about feeling better about ourselves and feeling good. It shouldn't be a punishment. In one of my books, Up Yours, the sort of the pursuit of radical self-care. And what I mean by radical, I'm talking about upping our levels of self-care across a wide-ranging and fundamentally from the ground up sort of domain. So, yes, sleep, diet, and exercise are how the engine keeps running. But if that's all we focus on, we're really doing ourselves a disservice. So I talk about looking up, which is kind of stop, smell the flowers. What is my sleep like? What's my diet and my exercise like? It's a bit like our bodies are a car. And we only get one car. We can't trade it in. If you're really lucky and you need spare parts, you might be able to find them. But generally, this is the car, this is the journey, and it's got to last the journey. And how we treat it is how it's going to sort of carry us, if you like. So that's a simple metaphor. But besides that, I mean, people like Dr. Dan Siegel talking about the healthy brain had a profound effect on me. The brain is an organ just like any other, but we for years tended to think of it as a supercomputer, and when we sleep, it's resting. And I remember thinking, there's something else going on when we're sleeping, because our body isn't that unproductive a machine that it needs to be in lockdown or shut down for 8 hours or 7 hours a night, unless something really important is going on. And now, of course, we know there is, about the glymphatic system flushing our brains of toxins and all of that stuff that's going on. But there's all these other things we can do around our sort of brain health. And 2024 was a year when I made some big changes. Again, working hard, lockdowns, all of that stuff that was going on. I found that I was starting to miss out on things, important elements like playtime and spontaneous fun without consequences, dance like no one's watching kind of an idea. Because when society is burning out and people in the workplace are and still are and continue to burn out, the first thing to go is that sense of fun, because we don't feel like we deserve it and we have to keep up and we're sort of wasting time if we're not. And so this idea of introducing, having conversations with people about what does play really mean to them. And you'll hear people say, "Oh, I play video games," and I can, nah, that's just a precursor to addiction. And it's a distraction. That's all that is. Oh, I play tennis. Yeah, exercise. Play with your non-dominant hand, and then come back and tell me how much fun it was. But there are things, of course, like tennis is a great playtime if you enjoy the game and you're mixing with friends and you're doing something that otherwise you wouldn't be doing. And so this was the year when I decided to do stuff like this for myself and exercise more. And, I'm getting into my final quarter of life probably. So I just wanted to make sure that my car keeps running for another little while. So lots of things I introduced this year, but, and maybe there's probably, let me think. There's at least probably 15 hours a week now that I'm doing for stuff for me that I wasn't doing last year. But my work level hasn't suffered at all. It's just I have a more fulfilling life. And so to me, radical self-care was all about, the basics, and then the sort of brain health and meditating and time in, time out, focusing, playtime, connecting with people, relationships, boundaries. That's all. That's an interesting conversation around boundaries, and what they are and what they're not, because I think boundaries are being hijacked into people thinking my boundary means I'm going to tell you how you're to behave towards me, and that's not a boundary. That's a barrier. That's not an effective sort of use of our own relationship with other people. But areas like that, I think we have to look at all of this stuff when we're looking at our self-care.
What's coming to me is, that's fine for those of us who can afford it. But you also work in organizations. And so I'm thinking about at least where I come from, capitalism hasn't typically been very kind.
No.
Or thoughtful or smart or even clever about how it treats employees. At the industrial level, we've created unions to keep people from being exploited. When I was a kid, my dad was a labor organizer. I used to go to these conferences. I was 7 or 8, and we'd hear presentations from organizers at the textile mills trying to put in safety so that people wouldn't lose their limbs. But now it seems like we've got a corporate culture in which young Mark Butlers are induced to burnout.
Yeah.
Early in my career in corporate development, I was working with Wall Street firms with young people who had just come out of college, first 2 or 3 years, who were all looking to make partner one day to climb a very, very steep and narrow pyramid.
Yeah.
And you could see right away that by age 30, that the vast majority would have left or would be divorced alcoholics.
Yeah, absolutely.
So how do you help? It's great to say to individuals, hey, play tennis, meditate, take a scented candle, bath. But how do you have influence over systems that and actually show them that doing this sort of thing is good for business as well as a decent thing to do for humans?
It's an ongoing challenge. Look, if you're a bit nerdy like me, the Work Health and Safety Act. There's an international standardization, ISO number. Do you know these ISO sort of standardization models? They're across.
I didn't. I've seen like ISO 9001,
yeah,
but I never knew what that was.
Yeah. Well, ISO 45001 talks about work health and safety in the workplace. The basic premise is that everybody deserves to go home from work. There's a subset of that, and that's been in place since 2010 or 11, somewhere like that. And it's a global standard now. But now there's a new ISO 45003, which is a subset of work health and safety, talks about psychosocial hazards in the workplace. Now, that's a lab coat word if ever I heard it. It's so academic. And basically what it talks about is work-related mental health. And so the work that we do, the international standard is coming in. It's not actually legislated globally yet. It is here in Australia. We were the first ones to take it on as a legal requirement of organizations to ensure that they are not doing anything that can harm the mental health and well-being of their people. And in fact, they have to be in a prevention space insofar as is sort of practicable. And of course, there's no legal definition of the word practicable. So it's what would a normal person deem to be normal sort of work-related behavior. And there's a number of people, Dr. Sue, I can't think of Sue's surname, but she's trademarked the phrase, the future is human. And so, it's talking about people first seems to be, it's going to be the legal requirement of organizations. You've got to look after your people first. And if you don't, some other organization will. So there's a sort of a changing of the guard, I think, that's coming, if it hasn't already arrived. I mean, 200 years ago, the Industrial Revolution said, we brought people in from the farms and had them working in factories, and we standardized and globalized all of this. And the feeling back then was it's not about people, it's about systems, and the system is going to ensure that the work gets done. And life was cheap. And if there was an accident or something happened in the conveyor belt system that broke down, the product was slowed down, we could pinpoint where the problem was, get rid of that person, or if they were killed in an industrial accident or something, replace them, and very quickly the system would keep going. But that's kind of disbanded in recent times. And I think people are recognizing now that the future actually is human. Certainly younger generations are seeing mental health and mental well-being as such an important part of any organization that they're going to join. And so an organization's employee value proposition, their EVP, has to recognize mental health and well-being as being a hugely important part of the offer. Which is all well and good until profits are shrinking, and then the organization, it's about profit again. And so we will hear that, yes, the mental health and well-being of our people is hugely important. There's just no budget for it, right? And that can happen. But I think we're reaching a point where we now recognize that the well-being of our people is so important if we're going to get the best from them. And that's, I think, the important point. That's why it's worth investing in your people, because if you've got engaged, happy employees, then that's an investment in the organization. I'm not a fan of this idea that, our people are our best asset. They're not your asset. You don't own them. They could leave in a heartbeat. So if you want to keep your people, you've got to keep them sort of well, fit and happy, and treat them with the sort of dignity and respect they deserve. And flogging the horse until it drops dead is not a good investment in your people, even though you might think you can replace them quickly. It's a bit like AI now. I mean, I can't speak about artificial intelligence or what the future holds. Just everybody that I call smart is saying that it's going to create more jobs than we lose, and we should not be afraid of it. But this much I know, that if there's a process in the work that we do is repeated, then it can be simplified, perfected, and then automated. So a lot of the mundane stuff that sort of, drags people down will actually become automated, and therefore the work that we do is going to change. We're already seeing, compared to sort of when I was a kid, we're employed to think now, aren't we? It's a thinking economy. Nobody lifts anything heavy anymore. You're not allowed. I mean, I think the heaviest weight anyone's legally allowed lift in Australia is 16 kilos. Now you think on a what do you call it? A building site, bags of concrete weigh 20 kilos. So technically 2 people should be lifting every bag of concrete. I don't know if that actually, or bag of cement. I don't know if that actually happens or not, but it's supposed to. So, we're not put through those sort of physically rigorous sort of work situations as much as we used to do. So we're kind of paid to think. And if you want people to think and operate and function best for you, you kind of can't run them into the ground and keep expecting them to perform. This idea of, what was it somebody said recently? This idea of there was a comment on social media that said, this woman is working 3 jobs to put her kids through college, and they saw this as some kind of a badge of honor until somebody pointed out and said, that is a dystopian bloody nightmare. Why should a woman have to work 3 jobs to put her children through an education system that should actually technically be free? Every government should be providing education for its population. And that really made me stop and think, why are we glorifying flogging people that hard?
I remember somebody posted something, and I first saw the words like philanthropy porn, and then I couldn't stop seeing it everywhere. That that we celebrate. Oh, this school teacher, her son needed an operation, and the community came together to fund it.
Yeah. Or
the only thing we'd be missing out on if we had healthcare in America is we wouldn't have Breaking Bad.
Yeah. Right.
He wouldn't have needed the money for his operation.
Yeah. Or it's, you see sort of posts about teachers are so dedicated that they spend their money to buy paper and pencils for their students. Why are they having to do that? You and I are both clearly lefty, Labour, sort of union-leaning people, because that was my background and my experience as well. And I lived in fear, actually, when we saw a younger generation heading towards the gig economy. I'm not going to work for an organization. I'm just going to work for who I want to, when I want to. And I remember thinking, 100 years of unions creating good working environments for people is about to disappear with one generation, because there'll be a race to the bottom for who's going to do the work cheapest. Then I think COVID came along, and then I think there was a bit of a separation of all of that. But I don't know where it's ended up. But my fear is that all of the protections that we've put in place for our people, if we lose that, we're going to lose so much. We're going to go backwards so far. And yet, I'm hoping organizations recognize that the investment in the well-being of their people, it's a bit like, slam the gate, the horse is bolted, if we push people too hard. But then, we can spend time looking to see which horse is going to bolt. But if we actually stop and think about it, happy horses don't bolt. We don't have to worry about it. If we look after our people, like Richard Branson said, look after your people. They look after your customers. It's not up to you to do that. Your people will do that if you look after them. Hopefully that's the sort of mindset that organizations will recognize in the fullness of time. I think they do. I think a lot do. They're seeing the value in looking after their people, because it's much easier to keep one than it is to replace one.
So, we've been hearing this sort of, business talk for probably 20 years now. And I'd say over the last 15, it's, you got Liz Wiseman, multipliers, you have book after book about manager as leader as coach rather than as dictator. And yet, so you and I in our world with our thought leaders, and shout out, this is where we met, the Thought Leaders Business School, thoughtleaders.com.au. Brilliant place that I've just discovered and been welcomed in the community.
Yeah.
I feel like Oliver has gotten into the, Fagin's den, and everyone's saying, consider yourself one of us.
Part of the furniture. Yeah, I feel the song coming up. Yeah.
So, but now I completely lost where I was going with that whole thing.
Oh, sorry. We shouldn't have started singing. But it was a conversation. Yeah, we were talking about, organizations and businesses looking out for their people.
Right. I got it back. Thank you. Sure. That given how obvious it is, it feels very similar to me to how obvious it is that people should eat whole foods and not junk food, and people should exercise instead of sitting on the couch, and yet the obvious doesn't get done. And I'm wondering for me, I've spent the last 10 years exploring and really getting to the bottom of human behavior around individual health. And I think
Yeah.
I understand it. I understand the forces, and I understand the societal forces and the biological forces and the psychological forces and the habitual forces. What do you see when you work in organizations? What are the obstacles and the resources, the obstacles against this kind of enlightened growth, and what are the resources that you can draw upon that are already there to help make these changes?
Wow, that's an interesting subject or an interesting thought process. The obstacles, generally speaking, are it's a bit like buying insurance. We don't need it until we need it. So very often the conversation is, yes, that's a very important. Mental health and well-being of our people is really important. We don't have a budget for it. And especially when business is challenged, it's the first sort of thing to get chopped from the budget in the pursuit of survivals, or if not profit, at least survival. And to my mind, where it's supported most of all is when an organization has experienced what it's like to not have an organization that has invested in the well-being of their people and has seen the outcome of it, which isn't always immediate and apparent. But I think they're the ones who continue to recognize that this is something that we have to keep doing and we have to keep chasing. I've seen that. But again, that's the easier sort of sell, if you like, to organizations and corporations that have invested in this in the past, seeing the value of it. I think.
And when you say this, what are
Yeah.
you specifically talking about? Is it sort of training or policies? Like what has to happen for an organization to move from the old style to a one in which radical self-care is possible?
Is valued. You know what it was? It was COVID. I think it was lockdowns. We went from 7% of the population might have worked remotely or in some kind of a hybrid sort of experience to about 97% of the corporate workforce was suddenly working from home. And our health, our well-being, our self-care suddenly became a conversation that was a nice to have before that, but now it was a need to have. We needed to know that we were able to look after our people if this business was going to survive, because we turned everything on its head, didn't we? And so then from that sprang new conversations around that. For me, certainly that's where it was. Our people are in this uncertain environment we've never been in before. We're concerned about them. We're worried about them. We want to make sure they're okay. And we're trying to make the business survive. How we're doing business has changed and probably might not ever go back to the way we used to. But what they found, in my experience was, we need to make sure our people are okay. And organizations that thought like that then had the loyalty of the people that they were looking after. Ones that didn't care so much about it lost their people. And have found, remember the phrase, the great resignation and quiet quitting and all of these ideas that sort of came about. Organizations that expressed a desire to look after their people and recognize what was important to them and listened to what was important to their people, I think came out of this much better than anybody else did. And it just meant that the conversation around mental health, which had long been kind of a nice to have, it certainly wasn't a need to have. But when it became okay to not be okay for a little while, we started to experience that and experience what it looked like to look after our people. And that's when I found, before that, I used to talk about mental health in the workplace, etc. But then it became all about burnout, because that's what was happening for people in lockdowns, etc. And I kind of got painted into that space for a long time, and I tried to get back out of it, but I found that's where we needed to be, and still are today. It's helping leaders to be able to have a caring conversation with their people, and the best ones can. And when they do, what it delivers is a safety and a trust and a sense of belonging and a cohesion and an engagement, and all of those things that make people feel like they matter to an organization. They're the ones that are surviving, and they're the ones that are doing well, because they're the ones that are keeping their people.
So when I'm listening to you, I'm filtering it through 2 conversations I've had with friends this week, one in the US, one in Australia, who are employees, longtime employees, very, very highly skilled, and they're both ready to quit because of their boss.
Yeah.
Has nothing to do with it probably has a lot to do with the company, but it's not what they're talking about. They're talking about this person is making my life miserable.
Yep.
And so what I'm curious about is like, who gets promoted these days? Is it if self-care, if taking care of people is a priority, that is it that we just, well-meaning people, but they get overwhelmed and they don't know how to manage, and so they're just expressing their own stress? Or are we systematically promoting people who are, good at the numbers, or who are still a little bit, psychopathic in their kill tendencies around business? Like, what do you see?
Look, it's really interesting. So I work in local government and state government, where very often one's sort of rise through the ranks is based on longevity, and I have now been elevated to the next layer in the sort of pay ranking, which means now I have to be a supervisor. And I may have no skills in that. I may have no interest in it, but it's where I need to be now, because I'm a level 6, and level 6 is always manage people. You know what I mean? So you've seen some of that, but I've also worked in the sort of technology space where it's merit based, generally speaking. But again, also in technology, and it's very often the smartest person gets elevated, not necessarily the people leader. So now we have situations where there are leaders and there are those who lead, and they're not always the same person. Dr. Travis Bradbury and Dr. Jean Greaves have done research in this whole emotional intelligence space, along with Daniel Goleman and Amy Edmondson, etc., talking about psychological safety. But they talk about emotional intelligence being a highly valued skill. In fact, Travis Bradbury's research says that 98% of business founders recognize emotional intelligence as being more important than IQ, and certainly more value to the business. And Travis Bradbury and Jean Greaves discovered 20 years ago that emotionally intelligent leaders earn about $25,000 US, which is about $40,000 Australian, more than somebody with a lower level of emotional intelligence, simply because they are more highly valued, and they run teams that are more connected and engaged, and they have an ability to recognize what the business needs above and beyond the sort of technical stuff.
Mm-hmm. All right. So
in terms of burnout, as an example, Howie, just to sort of finish on that point, if you like.
Go ahead.
Very often people think burnout is having too much work. But in my experience in the last couple of years, and when I'm speaking at conferences, I will very often ask this question: what is the number one mental health challenge in the workplace? And people say burnout. And I will ask, is it too much work? And I'm finding now about 50% of people are telling me that frustration is actually the cause of the burnout. And when I explore that a little bit more, very often what it is that, this idea we need to do more with less now. Times are challenging, business is challenged. We can't seem to recruit new people anyway. I don't know where they've all gone, but we can't seem to recruit new people into roles, or there's been a hiring freeze. And now everyone on the team is 8 people. It used to be 12. We're all doing more with less. And so, I'm doing 1.5 jobs. but I don't know what my priorities are anymore. And when I ask my leader for some guidance or advice, they're stressed out as well, and they tend to snap at me. So I go, I'm not going there again. So I will quiet quit, or I will flounder along until somebody tells me I'm getting it wrong. And so the only feedback I'm getting is the negative feedback, which, as we know, if that's all you're hearing, it's going to amount to frustration or bullying charges or something. So what's happening is, when we're trying to do more with less because the business is demanding it, what we're actually doing is creating this burnout section that doesn't need to be, but it's not always having too much work. It's actually not knowing what work is needed, because we've kind of normalized having too much work now, for better or for worse. So it's an interesting twist on the sort of what we think burnout actually is now.
Well, what I'm hearing is that burnout selectively targets people who give a shit.
Yeah, there's a bit of that. Again, it's like the emotional response idea I was saying a while ago. If we're suppressing our emotional sort of need, or our need from our environment or from ourselves, if we're pushing that down in the pursuit of getting more done, or trying to keep up, I would say that's exactly what it is.
All right, because I'm thinking about, one of the most profound movies of all time is Office Space. All right, do you know it?
I'm not sure I do. Which one is Office Space?
Office Space is the guy who's working at this corporation, and his boss is, can you get us the TPS report? And he's very alienated. And then he goes, his girlfriend thinks that he's too emotionally distant. So she drags him to therapy. And this is the very first scenes of the movie. He gets hypnotized and told to relax and to not care about anything right now. Yeah. And then the therapist drops dead of a heart attack. And so he's stuck, not caring. And all of a sudden, work just doesn't bother him. He's having the best time.
Oh, I love it. I don't know the movie. I'm gonna dig it out, because it's right up my alley. Oh, it's right up my alley. You can find
he gets interviewed by the experts, the productivity experts from outside are brought in. They're both named Bob, the two Bobs.
Right.
And they're interviewing. He says, and he's just talking about, that I'll probably doodle for 15 minutes and, and then he's writing everything down.
Oh, I love it. No, I'm going to have to check. You're a font of new books and movies for me to watch in this conversation. Howie, thank you for that.
I'm clearly revealing the bubble that I'm in. They're thinking that these are the cultural centers of the universe here.
But look, I completely get what you're saying, and I would sort of concur with the point as well. The people who burn out most are the ones who do give a shit. Yeah, I guess if you're engaged, but it's also the fastest way to become disengaged, isn't it? When we find that we can't keep up, and we've tried blaming everything else, but now we're going to have to blame ourselves. We'll probably stop giving a shit round about then.
Yeah.
And we're of no value to anybody. It's like a flickering candle versus a blown out or an extinguished one. That's Gordon Parker's idea. If the candle is flickering, you can protect it from the wind and the flame will come back. But if it's blown out, we got a few conversations and a few decisions to make. Do we relight it? Do we get another candle? Do we move it to a different place and light it there? What do we do with this one? Yeah, and so if the people who give a shit are the ones who are pushing themselves and trying more and more and trying harder, and they're the ones that we lose most of all, it's not a good look for us or the business. It's not a good outcome. Yeah.
I'm looking at it's the bottom of the hour, so I want to let you get back to your life. But before you do, tell people how they can find you. You've got, for those who are watching this on YouTube,
sure.
You've got a bunch of books behind you. So it's time for your advert.
Well, I've been enjoying our conversation so much. It feels like I shouldn't, but if people do want to find me or want to,
you're doing this for their benefit, not yours.
Okay, cool. All right, thank you very much. Mark www.markbutler.au is my website, and you
that's
can
Mark with a K.
Mark with a K, yeah. markbutler.au is my website. My email address is mark@markbutler.au. You'll find me on LinkedIn. I'm always up for a chat and a conversation on there. If anybody wants to tap in and ask me anything that we've just been talking about, I love a chat. I'll very happily have a conversation with anyone that wants to ask me anything that they want to ask. And if you want to find my books around.
Do you work remotely or do you travel? Like if someone's listening to this in the States or Europe and they're like, we need help with burnout, is that...
Absolutely. Yeah. I travel and I work everywhere. In actual fact, can I share a quick story with you? Do you see this little badge I'm wearing? Can you see it?
It looks like there's green, I think.
Well, there's people, a person with people behind them, basically.
Okay, yep.
So, and actually I just shared my puppy hairs there now as well, sorry, but I received this in the mail today from, there's a team of people that are part of an international organization, and they are steel workers in the north of England, Sheffield sort of direction. And if anybody knows that area, these are steel workers in the north of England are hard people. They've lived tough, hard lives. But having conversations about mental health doesn't come easy to some of these blue collar, to be like some of the mining, construction industries. And I've worked with them around how can we sort of set it up so that we could have conversations and feel comfortable having them. And so we've worked with metaphors and we've worked with safe words, etc. But out of necessity, they've come up with this idea, and I'm not going to try and use their accent, but if you're known as a good egg if you're sort of somebody who is approachable and kind and nice. And so the Good Egg Society, they made me an honorary member. I'm really, really chuffed about. So anybody who's wearing that is a good egg, and any of their work colleagues, if they see the badge, they know that person is up for a mental health conversation and sort of a check-in to see how they're doing and to support them if they need some sort of help. Isn't that just the
awesome.
Coolest thing?
Congratulations!
Thank you very much.
I don't know how my vegan audience feels about good eggs, but I'm sure I'll find out.
We're gonna find out. But it's just yup, he's a good egg, that one.
It's been a pleasure talking to you. I do have to jump off for another call now,
sure,
but I hope we can continue this in future episodes.
I would love to, Howie, because I'm writing my next book now, which is on sort of leaders, how to have the critical caring conversations that they need to be able to have with their people. So maybe we can chat about that as I unpack it and write it.
That's a deal.
It might be a useful topic for your people, for your listeners as well.
I love it. Mark Butler, thank you for all you do and for taking the time today.
Dr. Howie, thank you very much indeed for your time. I've loved chatting to you. It's been really, really enlightening. Thank you.
All right. Catch you later.
Okay.
And that's a wrap. The show notes for today's episode are at plantyourself.com/584. So what's going on? Still recovering from a back injury, so I've been starting to do some strengthening stuff. Yesterday had a workout in which I just walked upstairs. It was raining, so very slippery. Taking them 3 at a time, nice and slow, so kind of big quad workouts, and I'm hoping that's going to help. This coming weekend, I'm going to be doing some bicycling. Friend from the U.S. is coming to south of France, and I looked at a map, and it turns out that France and Spain are adjacent, and northern Spain, where I live, and south of France are pretty close together, and northeastern Spain and southwest of the south of France are even closer. So it's a 3-hour train ride, a couple of buses, and I get to see what bicycling in France is all about. So hopefully not too many saddle sores, and I'll come back with some good photos and good memories. And that's about it for me today. So as always, be well, my friends. All right, time for thanks. Thanks to Will Ridenauer for allowing me to use his beautiful song Sabali Dawn, the Dance of Peace. You can find more of Will's music at his website, willridenauer.com. And of course, thanks to all of you Plant Yourself podcast patrons. Kim Harrison, Lynn McClellan, Brittany Porter, Dominic Maurer, Barbara Whitney, Tammy Black, Amy Good, Amanda Hatherley, Mary Jane Wheeler, Ellen Kennelly, Melissa Cobb, Rachel Behrens, Tina Scharf, Tina Ahern, Jen Filkinovsky, David Bizek, The Mysterious Michelle X, Elsbeth Feldman, Leah Stoller, Alan Christensen, Colleen Peck, Michelle Landry, Josina, Sarah Durkis, Kelly Cameron, Janet Selby, Claire Adams, Tom Franzek, Jeanette Benham, Gila Cert, David Donahue, Blair Cyber, Dorona Vizov, Gio and Carolyn Argentati, Jody Friesner, Misha Rosen, Michael Warbeck, Aviva Lael, Alicia Lemus, Val Linneman, Nick Harper, Bandana Chawley, Molly Levine, The Inscrutable Harry R., Susan Laverty, The Panda Vegan, Craig Kovic, Adam Scharf, Karen Burry, Heather Morgan, Nigel Davies, Marion Blum, Teresa Copel, Julian Watkins, Breed O'Connell, Sharon Hirschman, Linda Ayat, Holm Hedegaard, Isa Tuzinwa, Connie Hainline, Aaron Greer, Alicia Davis, Heather O'Connor, Carolyn Jensen, Sherry Olakoski of Plant Powered for Health, Karen Smith, Scott Marani, Karen and Joe Crabtree, Kirby Burton, Teresa Carell, Kevin McCauley, Elizabeth Rothschild, Ann Jesse, Cheryl Dwyer, Jenny Hazelton, Peter W. Evans, Dennis Bird, Darby Kelly, Laurie Fanny, Linnea Lundquist, Emily Iconelli, Levy Wallach, Rosamund McAtee, Dan Picorni, Stephen Leenan, Patty DiMartino, Mike and Donna Kartz, Deanne Bishop, Bilberry Elf, Marjorie Lewis, Tricia Adams, Nancy Sheldon, Lindsay Bayshore, Gunmarie Hagan, Tracy Gullidge, Laura Heaton, Meg from Mama Says, Stacey Stokes, Ben Savage, Michael Kay, David Hughes, Connie Rogers, Claire England, Sally Robertson, Paranganchi, Amy Daly, Brian Tourville, Mark Jeffrey Johnson, Josie Dempsey, Karen Schmidt, Pamela Hayden, Emily Perryman, Allison Corbett, Richard Stone, Lauren Vaught of Edible Musings, Aaron Hasty, Sean Owen, Sagar Naik, Erica Piedra, Danielle Roberts, Michael Lushton, Sarah Johnson, Catherine Floyd, for your generous support of the podcast. That's it for now. As always, be well, my friends.